That's definitely on the agenda because that's a large part of today's assignment, I think. Right, okay. All right, so let's go back to the tail end of the last assignment, picking up around 258, which I don't think we explicitly treated, namely the question of guilt. And on page 259, in about the middle of our page 259, and therefore about the middle of the middle paragraph, he says, however, when Dasein addresses itself as guilty, where should its idea of guilt be drawn from, if not from the interpretation of its own being? The question arises again, who says how we are guilty and what guilt means? The idea of guilt cannot be arbitrarily thought up and forced upon Dasein, but if an understanding of the essence of guilt is possible at all, this possibility must have been sketched out in Dasein beforehand. And in the sixth from the bottom line of that paragraph, but where do we get our criterion for the primordial existential meaning of guilty? From the fact that this guilty turns up as a predicate of the I am. Does what is understood as guilt in inauthentic interpretation possibly lie in the being of Dasein as such, in such a way that it is also already guilty in that it actually factically exists? Over on page 261, in the first paragraph beginning on 261, the clarification of the phenomenon of guilt, which is not necessarily related to having debts and breaking the law. So he's obviously what he's doing here, as always, is attempting to get, as it were, underneath the ontic or existential understanding of guilt, right, as being guilty for having done something or not having done something, that type of thing. What is the primordial constitutional nature of Dasein in terms of which this existential guilt can be understood? So not necessarily related to having debts and breaking the law can be successful only if we ask beforehand in principle about the being guilty of Dasein. That is, if the idea of guilty is conceived in terms of the kind of being of Dasein. For this purpose, the idea of guilty must be formalized to the extent that the vulgar phenomena of guilt related to being with others in taking care of things are excluded. The idea of guilt must not only be removed from the area of calculating and taking care of things, but must also be separated from relationship to an ought and a law, such that by failing to comply with it, one burdens himself with guilt. For here too, guilt is still necessarily defined as a lack, when something which ought to be and can be is missing. But to be missing means not being objectively present. All right, so if Dasein is not ever, is not an inner worldly being, it is an inner worldly being, so we can understand them to be objectively present. Dasein cannot authentically, certainly, understand itself to be an inner worldly being, to be objectively present, and therefore, whatever guilt means in terms of the being of Dasein, which is not an objectively present form of being, whatever guilt can mean in terms of the being of Dasein, it cannot be guilt as a lack, because he understands lack to be a relationship that exists only among objectively present beings. A lack as the not being objectively present of what ought to be is a determination of being of objective presence. In this sense, nothing can be essentially lacking in existence. We have to read this text slowly, right? Because nothing lacking in existence, but existence is the whole point here, right? In other words, existence is what Dasein is essentially, right? And existence is being that the being of Dasein is such that it is that being for which its being itself is an issue. And so that's what it means to exist, right? So the objectively present inner worldly beings, they do not exist, right? They are extant, they are at hand, whatever they may be, but they do not exist, right? And therefore, when he says, although we might in most philosophical texts read that very quickly, right? In other words, a lack as not being objectively present of what ought to be is a determination of being objectively present. In this sense, nothing can be essentially lacking in existence. We have to go slow there. Nothing in existence. And there's in the being of Dasein as the being for which its being itself is an issue. In this sense, that is, in the sense of a lack, nothing can be essentially lacking in the being there of Dasein, not because it is complete, but because its character of being is distinguished from any kind of objective presence. Still, the quality of the not is present in the idea of guilty. All right, so even though the not is not a lack, or not to be understood in terms of lack, nevertheless, the not is there. That's what he wants to say, right? If the guilty is to be able to define, if the guilty is to be able to define existence, and again I underline the word existence, the ontological problem arises here of clarifying existentially the not quality of this not. Furthermore, there belongs to the idea of guilty what is expressed without differentiation in the concept of guilt as being responsible for, being the ground for. Thus, we define the formal existential idea of guilty as being the ground for a being which is determined by a not, that is, being the ground of a nullity. I'm thinking, I'm reading, Badiou's Being an Event finally came into English. I don't know if you're aware of that. Yeah, so I've started on that. It's a major intellectual challenge. But it's very interesting when you're reading Heidegger to pick up Being an Event because, for a number of reasons. But of course, Badiou's ontology is mathematics, by which he means, fundamentally, he means set theory. And I don't know if this is the correct way of putting it, but the fundamental or first set of set theory is the null set, right? The empty set. So I also want to make reference to, well, I might as well do all this at one time. So when we, well, let me say something else that I find interesting in Badiou's text that right away stuck out at me because of the coincidence of reading Heidegger while reading his text, and that is Badiou makes the point that the symbol in set theory for being a member of is the Greek epsilon, little e. So A epsilon beta is A belongs to B, or A is a member of alpha is a member of beta or whatever. Right? What's interesting is that Badiou makes the point, and it almost doesn't make any difference whether he's right or wrong. Right? He makes the point, and I have no reason to dispute it. He makes the point that really all of mathematics, the fundamental relationship of mathematics, is the epsilon. That is, if I translate it into the set theory lingo, which coincides with, very interesting, with the fundamental notion of Heidegger, epsilon means belonging. So alpha belongs to beta, right? And it just struck me, right? In other words, we're dealing with Heidegger, who is famous for his wanting to distance himself from the calculative aspects of technological civilization and so forth and so on, right? And the kind of calculation that goes on in this world of objective presence, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, because, as we were saying in a totally different context last time, in a way analogous to the way in which he is undermining Kierkegaard, right? That is, in other words, undermining Kierkegaard in the sense of beginning with the Kierkegaardian insight into the solitary or single individual in the Kierkegaardian sense. Now that solitariness, that singleness, becomes in Heidegger more fundamentally constitutive of Dasein in its most authentic being toward death, you say, where it is individuated, or you say individualized, singularized. I think it would be probably a better translation of the German here, and the idea. Not so much individuated in the logical sense, you see, but in that existential sense of Kierkegaard is now existentialized, AL, in Heidegger, right? Now, I'm rehearsing that just to say that there's an analogy, I think, going on here, which Badiou, wittingly or unwittingly, calls to my attention, and that is, you see, just as we're going beneath the realm of metaphysics, in terms of which Kierkegaard could be understood as perfectly in the negative, you see, metaphysically perfectly absurd, right? Which Kierkegaard is the first to announce of his own position, right? Well, we're going to undermine that. We're going to take that solitude, that isolation of the metaphysically absurd individual related to God in Kierkegaard. We're going to take that to a more fundamental, constitutional, fundamentally ontological level, right, in Heidegger. Analogously, as we go down from the existentialism of Kierkegaard to the existentialism of Heidegger, analogously we're going down from, as it were, the mathematical, calculative realm of science, which is one of the issues that comes up late in today's assignment. We're going down from that mathematical realm to an undermining of that mathematical realm. And the point I'm trying to make is that as we go from a Kierkegaardian singleness to a Heideggerian singleness of authentic Dasein in its being toward death, right? Analogously, we're going from the belonging, which I'll take Badiou's word for it, is the fundamental relationship of all mathematics. We're not getting rid of no more than Kierkegaard's singleness is, in an unqualified sense, abandoned by Heidegger. No more is the belongingness of the mathematical relationship abandoned. Quite the contrary. I mean, if you read Heidegger, but first, let's say, no more is the belongingness of the mathematical relationships of the world of objective presence simply abandoned by Heidegger, but he wants to undermine the meaning of belonging. Do you see what I'm saying? So in today's text, when he finally gets to the mathematical section or the section on science, he says it's not really the mathematics per se, it's the project, the project nature of the beings which are the object of science, right? That they contain implicit. I don't want to anticipate this too fundamentally, too quickly, too simply, but I would say, roughly speaking, I think it's fair to say, roughly speaking, for openers, that what he's saying there in that section on science is that what modern science discovered in its understanding of the universe in mathematical terms, more fundamentally than the mathematical precision of the operations, it was what I would call, playing with his language a little bit, the projective nature of the objects of science, namely that somehow in and of themselves they contain their own intelligibility in some sense, you see. Or, so if I put that in real simple everyday terms, what he's really saying in effect, as it were now, I have to be careful with Heidegger, right? But he's really pointing to the deeper significance of the predictiveness of modern science. In other words, the real test of science, the test of science is the ability to make a hypothesis that is true to the extent to which it is to the extent to which it is able to be positively related to a prediction, right? Think of Peirce. We did a lot of Peirce in here, one way or the other, didn't we? Yeah, we did American philosophy. And so what do we say in what is Peirce's understanding of an idea or of a concept, where he's a pragmatist, so he hasn't quite gotten down to the depth of Heidegger, right? But what is the purpose of a concept? For Peirce, it's a rule for action. And that is, if I put that in Heideggerian terms, that's an understanding of the concept which is going to be preeminently for Peirce, not exclusively, but preeminently scientific. It'll also be moral, and it'll also be aesthetic, right? But at the top of that heap for Peirce, in some sense, right, the culmination of the concept is scientific. It's futural, right? It's futural, right? Futural. In the Heideggerian sense, is true of the Peircean understanding of the function of a concept, because the concept is, for Peirce, all concepts, all thinking is, in some sense, fundamentally hypothetical, right, and predictive. Now, how did I get off on that? Oh, okay, nullity. So, if I'm right that what we have in Heidegger is an undermining, I mean, that's a kind of neologism in here, right? A kind of with a positive sense, right? Undermining, deepening in a way that can be frustrating, right? Because it can always be deeper and deeper. But the deepening of the concept of singleness in Kierkegaard, in Heidegger, the deepening of the concept of belonging in the mathematical world of objective presence, the deepening of that in Heidegger, the belonging of Dasein to being, for example. On that latter analogy, then, when I look at nullity here, I have a deepening of the idea of, in effect, in Badiou's terms now, the null set, that is, the empty set. So, in other words, what is the nullity of, what is the guilt here? It's not lacking something that is missing, but it is the, I was going to say ironically, but maybe not ironically, it is the very openness, it's the very constitution of Dasein as disclosing things in the world, that disclosure, that clearing, you see, that openness, that has to be in some sense a fundamental emptiness. But not a lack in the sense that something should be there that's missing, you see what I'm saying? So it's, if it were an objectively present thing, then this openness would be a lack, there'd be something missing, you see? But since it's not an objectively present being, all right, the structure of Dasein is such that that openness is not a lack, and yet it is, like the null set, it's an emptiness. There's nothing there, right? Okay. So
does he go on to riff or to talk a little bit more about the, like, why guilty though? I'm a little not clear about that, which maybe we'll.
Well, I think he's working backwards. I think the answer to your question is, one of the points that I want to stress, if I hit the right page at the right time in here, but I'll say it anyways, even if I don't hit the right page at the right time, which he said it before, but he says it again somewhere in today's assignment. He draws attention to the fact it comes up very early when he first makes the distinction in the early sections between existential and existential, between, and I've kind of rehearsed that distinction here in the Kierkegaard, the Heidegger singularity, and the Badiou mathematical belonging to the more primordial belonging that is of the very structure of the constitution of Dasein. I'm tempted to say, you're right. I mean, the reason your question arises, I think, is because you say, well, wait a minute. If we're talking about this primordial structure, and we've just spent a page or two distinguishing guilt at that level, so to speak, from anything that we would normally, existentially, ontically, in an everyday sense, understand by guilt, then why call it guilt? I think.
Well, it makes me think of St. Augustine and Augustine's understanding of original sin. Constitutionally, we're thrown or born into this situation where we're predisposed to this particular state of sin, so to speak.
Right. We've inherited that, right, from Adam and Eve, right.
And that's something, I mean, this obviously isn't functioning in the same way, but I keep hearing overtones of that there's some inheritance of something that one, as Dasein, has absolutely no choice about. There's a choice.
Right.
There's a choice on the hither side of it, possibly, in terms of how one is going to relate to one's death and being towards death and so forth.
Right.
But initially there is no. In Augustine, I guess it's even more drastic. There's you absolutely, as a being, have no choice, even in the. I guess there isn't a function in Augustine of being towards your death. But I'm not sure exactly where to go with that. But I'm just wondering: is he recouping in some sense the? I get the relationship from Kierkegaard to. I get how he's ontologizing this singular guilt and kind of universalizing it and making it a universal, singular place where where Dasein, as somebody who's born into this world, is going to be ontologically. But I just wonder why. I mean, does he do something eventually with the etymology of the word guilt that then there's a little twist on it or something?
I'm not aware of that. I don't think so. I think the answer to your question was I was about to say, but I wanted to let you expand on it a little bit because the reference to Augustine is interesting. But I think it would apply in any event, bracketing Augustine a moment. What I was about to say was that as he makes clear that when he first distinguishes the existential from the existential from the existential, I pointed out there, I think that in the context of that text, that in fact the analogy I made at that point was, although this would, well, I don't know if I get that. Kierkegaard and Husserl, and if you took Kierkegaard as the existential guy par excellence, right, the ontic sense of solitude, pure and simple, and then you took Husserl as the ontological solitude, as it were abstracted from the ontic everyday world, the phenomenological ego, transcendental ego of Husserl, as an abstract solitude, ontological solitude, then in going deeper, right, he's not going deeper on that same plane of alternatives. The real deepening is as it were, would be in a metaphysical sense a synthesis, as it were, but it's not really a synthesis either, because that would be just a little bit too neat, too satisfying, too final, too much getting to the point, okay? But there's this continuing tension, I want to say irreducible relationship. I'm tempted to say, there's a continual belonging, you see, of the ontological existential analysis to the existential experience of Dasein. They belong together, right? And you cannot really separate them. So my direct answer to your question would be, he doesn't have to find etymological trick here for the guilt thing, because he starts, as it were, with the existential experience of Dasein as being guilty. We have many ways in which we experience guilt, you say. So he's just transferring that back. In fact, he has a little Latin expression somewhere in today. I don't know whether it doesn't. He's not talking about guilt. He's talking about
conscience. No.
I don't know. But it's a posteriori. Denominatio. I'm trying to remember what the noun is. The point being that it's an expression which says that it's the same principle. I don't know whether I have that anywhere, but I'm just curious myself what the reference was. It's not critical at this point. We may come across it. Anyway, the point being, he makes the point in a slightly different context in today's assignment, that he names something can be. He calls it a rule. This posteriori. I just can't remember what it is. I want to say it isn't res, but it could be res. The thing is named from a posteriori, from that which is more, literally in the Latin, it's a little tough to translate, more powerful, more possible, right? The idea is that existential guilt, ontic guilt, is made possible by this ontological guilt. And therefore, he applies the rule, not talking about guilt, I don't think, I can't remember what now. He applies the rule, however, but he's applying it here in effect, that we name something in terms of its that which makes it possible, okay? It's hard to express it. So what I'm saying, in effect, what I'm trying to say is that the primordial guilt is called guilt because that, what I call that, or he calls that nullity, that being the ground of a nullity, is the a posteriori. It is the more possible, the more powerful. It is the root, right, of what we experience as guilt.
It's the same.
Yeah.
Could we say the same thing, that the inauthentic guilt is only possible because of the authentic primordial guilt?
Yes, I think you could say yes.
Or vulgar.
Right. Yeah. Or well, it may be time. It may be temporality he's talking about when he uses the Latin phrase. I think this primordial temporality, all right, is the possibility of the everyday vulgar understanding of temporality. It's that kind of thing. So, and therefore, you see, and that's where the misunderstanding which he keeps guarding against is liable to come in, because we start off, since we are initially and for the most part lost in the they-ness of the world, we start off with this kind of everyday notion of temporality, and he doesn't want to change the word for what is the root of that, right? What is the ontological root of that ontic experience? He doesn't want to change the word. It's still temporality, but now we have the problem of always saying, if we're going to call that temporality, it's not tick, click, click, tick tock, tick tock. It's not a series of nows, right? It's really the ontological structure of Dasein in being in the world itself, ahead of itself, right? And so it's that structure which has, in a certain quotational sense, a pastness and a future and a present. But past, future, and present are not the past, future, and present of the vulgar concept of time. Right? But time as we experience it as past and future and present, as we experience it ontically, is made possible by that deeper, more fundamental ontological structure of Dasein. Right? It's that, I think. So it's a similar kind of thing. So where would you get off calling the being in the world ahead of itself, calling that temporality? You would have the same objection that you would have as why call this thing which is not a lack in the ontological sense, not an indebtedness, not a failure to do or doing what you ought not to do. Why call it guilt? Well, for the same reason that you would call the ontological structure of Dasein temporality, even though we understand we don't mean by that time in the ordinary sense of the word. I think that's the way he's moving. Yeah. I'm sorry. So I just want to round the circle off. So, and the justification for that is not arbitrary for him. The justification is what I'm calling this belonging together, this inseparability ultimately of the existential and the existential, ontic and ontological. Yeah.
I had the same question that Todd had, because it brought the reading about the ontological guilt brought up the question of, for me, this sounds like a reintroduction at some other level of original sin. Right.
Okay.
So what I was just wondering about, I'm not sure you could even have an answer for it, is he looks at so many questions that may come up along the way and distinguish himself from that. Why the question didn't occur to him, well, this must sound like original guilt and original sin, and this is not what I mean, or maybe it's just what I mean.
No, he doesn't mean it. He doesn't mean that. That's the other part of the question with St. Augustine. The sense of inherited guilt in the theological sense, that theological concept would
not
be
present yet.
That's right. It would be undermined by this. In other words, the reason that can even come up, that theological concept can occur, so to speak, has to do with the more fundamental guilt of Dasein. Guilt, if you want, in quotes. That's the way he's thinking. The other thing, just to say what I said about the belonging together of the ontic and the ontological, the way he puts it in somewhere in today's assignment, that he even goes so far as to say that that the ontic is the basis of the ontological, right? In other words, not only do they belong together, but in some sense we start off, and that goes back to the linguistic question, right? The basis of our ontological analysis is the basis in that sense, the place from which we start, the foundation of our ontological analysis is our existential experience, right? Okay.
So I can't help but ask one more question.
Sure.
Now that you brought Badiou up. So the null set, the way that he speaks of this,
right?
He's speaking of a
who's he? Which he now?
Badiou. He's speaking of. I mean, he's obviously taking this notion up, right? From Heidegger in some sense, historically. I mean,
yeah, he's empathetic to Heidegger, right? I don't know whether he's okay.
So the
but go
null
ahead.
set, though, I mean, if it is this kind of not a lack, but a kind of emptiness of
right.
of I don't know what you call it. Let's just call it a kind of emptiness. Badiou kind of makes a positive light out of that, doesn't he? In some sense, I mean, he's certainly not going to be.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it becomes the positive project for which one can understand the event, and he's certainly not starting from a place that would be called guilt in any sense. I don't think.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Is he or
no? I think that's right. Yeah.
So it's like he. Well.
Although it's a little tricky because when we did the ethics seminar, where you would come closest I think in Badiou's texts, plural, to the question of guilt would be in the ethics question, and the void, which would be that which can only be retrospectively seen. I have to be careful with the language here; it gets technical. How can I put it? The void, which is that which is never presented in the situation, but the void is that which can retrospectively be seen, as it were, following the event. Right? In other words, when something occurs that doesn't fit the situation, right? That is the possible inauguration of the subject whose faithfulness to the event takes the form of inscribing in the situation and therefore, in a sense, transforming or forcing the situation in light of the event. All right? Well, that event, in its own way, retrospectively calls attention to the void, which otherwise would have no attention called to it, for want of a better way of putting it, right? So what I'm thinking is that in Badiou, implicitly, there is a relationship between the void, the nothing multiplied, the nothing that doesn't ordinarily appear in the situation, and to use a Leahy term, I don't know if there's a Badiou term, but and the imperative of faithfulness to the event that occurs, that ensues upon the event. The subject, in other words, is to be faithful to the event, but the subject need not be faithful to the event, and therefore I think there's at least the possibility of some notion, even for Badiou, of an authentic guilt. That is, it would take the form of unfaithfulness to the event. Right. And that what I'm getting at is, but the event in turn is inconceivable in Badiou's understanding, I believe, apart from the null set, apart from the void, apart from the nothing multiplied. Right. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that's clarifying.
Okay, I think there is that kind of implicit connection, although to the best of my knowledge, I don't know that he's worked that out in any elaborate way. Okay, or specific way. Okay. So back on page 261, the ground of nullity. If the idea of the not present in the existentially understood concept of guilt excludes relatedness to anything, existentially understood concept of guilt excludes relatedness to anything objectively present, which is possible or which ought to be. If thus Dasein is altogether incommensurable with something objectively present or valid, which it itself is not, or which is not in the way Dasein is, that is, exists, So any possibility that with regard to being the ground for lack, the being that is itself such a ground might be calculated as deficient is a possibility that is excluded. So just to drive the point home. In other words, this nullity that Dasein is, or the ground of a nullity that Dasein is not a lack, and it is not in any sense a deficient mode. All right? So which may be just another way of saying not a lack, but so if a lack, such as the failure to fulfill some requirement, has been caused in a way characteristic of Dasein, we cannot simply calculate back to a deficiency of the cause. Being the ground for need not have the same character of not as the privatum grounded in it and arising from it. So the alpha privative, the deficiency, the lack of something positive, that's an ontic truth for Dasein, which is as privatum is not to be taken back, as it were, to the ontological constitution of Dasein. All right, what I'm calling the openness, the emptiness, the nullness. Nullness would be a Germanic way of putting nullity, right? It's the Latin.
So it is kind of it's positive.
It's positive, right? It's positive. That's right. Yeah. Now that also reminds me of Hegel, as we were saying, I guess before you guys walked in. But the Hegelian influence on Heidegger is profound. I mean, not just personally. I mean, intellectually. Part of the structure of the history of thought. And so, speaking of original sin, so it's by analogy now, right? When we go back from original sin to this, everybody wants to intuit here that we're talking about a kind of ontological, primordial anticipation, as it were, of the theological notion of original sin. When we go back to that level and then pause and think, in this sense, nullity is positive, right? It's not a deficiency. It's not, or a guilt. Guilt is positive. That's the Hegelian connection. When you read Hegel, you don't have to read very far in the relevant texts of Hegel to find out that the fall of Adam and Eve was a positive event, right? Their becoming guilty is absolutely positive for Hegel. It's a maturing, right? It's a leaving behind the kind of childish ignorance, right? So the becoming aware of good and evil, eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is a positive event for Hegel. It's a function, and this is very deeply working in this pre-indetermination Heideggerian occupation of what otherwise would be the universal in the Hegelian system, but now qua finite. That is the finitude of the world prior to any Hegelian metaphysical move to understand it in terms of a thesis and antithesis, a dialectical negation. I think that's still coming up. Did we skip that? I don't think. No, we didn't yet. Yeah, it's coming up. So yes. Heidegger is, in effect, perhaps without drawing attention to it, he is undermining the notion of original sin, but he's undermining in a way that is faithful to Hegel's fundamental attitude that original sin, or guilt, all right, is a positive, all right, and it is a positive here in this primordial sense for Heidegger too. All right, so being the ground for the ground need not acquire a nullity of its own from what is grounded in it. But this means that being guilty does not result from an indebtedness, but the other way round. Now, this should remind you of Levinas, right? Who also is indebted to Heidegger here. But the other way around. Indebtedness is possible only on the basis of a primordial being guilty. What I was about to say a moment ago, with the reference to Hegel, which I think comes out later on in effect in in today's assignment. The positive why is this primordial guilt? why is being the ground of a nullity not a deficiency, not a lack, and in some sense, in what sense is it positive? Because it is, in Heideggerian terms, it is another way of speaking of the potentiality for being itself that is of the very structure of Dasein. So that openness, that potentiality, I think you could say it functions, it's the Heideggerian understanding of freedom. All right, so it's the freedom of Dasein. I don't want to say requires. The freedom of Dasein is, right, its emptiness, its potentiality, structurally, constitutionally, right, its openness, right, and the retrieve of that, as he says, the recouping of that is what is presumably taking place in resoluteness, so that one is. But that freedom is not, interesting enough, now Sartre comes into mind. Even in Sartre, it wouldn't be fair to say. Sartre puts being and nothingness in a kind of, they don't penetrate, but they are inseparably bound together, so to speak. What I was going to say, some of which might apply in a qualified sense to Sartre, is that what is not true in Heidegger, and as he says in a number of different ways, there's no abstraction of human freedom from the world. That is, right? It's being in the world and being open. I don't want to say they're two sides of the same coin, but they belong together, right? They are inconceivable, really, apart from one another. So there's no abstract ego here, right? So the selfhood is a selfhood which otherwise we would understand in a Hegelian sense. True selfhood is freedom, right? Think of Kant in a moral sphere, the autonomy of the self, right? So human freedom is autonomy for Kant. That absolute self-enclosedness of the divine idea, of which we are the instances in a Hegelian universe, and in conformity with which we are as citizens of the state, it would seem to American very paradoxically so, but most truly free, most truly rational. You see, all that notion of subjectivity and selfhood and so forth and freedom, that's not, again, abandoned in Heidegger by any means whatsoever, but it is undermined, right? It is the notion that being in the world and being a self is not being an ego apart from the world, right? But that the selfhood of Dasein, its authentic selfhood, is its potentiality for being itself, which is not something other than its structure as being in the world. And then the temporality comes in, that when we look at that more closely, being in the world means finding oneself in the world ahead of oneself. Okay, we'll come to that. All right. All right, let's take a look at the knot over there on page 263. Is this the page you were talking about, or
Yes.
did I?
262 and 263.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
before maybe we move to the knot, just the use of the word ground here.
All right. On
262, and
Yeah.
I mean it starts
Where,
in 261. It's a
where particular on 262? Do you have a?
The next to last paragraph.
yeah, the
The-
longer next to last. Starting
All
with
right. Being the ground that is existing as throne, Dasein constantly lags behind its possibility. It is never existent before its ground, but only from it and as it. Thus, being the ground means never to gain power over one's own most being from the ground up. It's interesting when I read this. I think of this question of foundation that is, pardon the pun, fundamental in the thinking now occurring. This knot belongs to the existential meaning of thrownness. Being the ground, it itself is a nullity of itself. Nullity by no means signifies not being objectively present or not subsisting, but means a not that constitutes this being of Dasein, its thrownness. The quality of this not, as a not, is determined existentially. Being a self, Dasein is the thrown being as self, not through itself, but released to itself from the ground in order to be as this ground. Dasein is not itself the ground of its being, because the ground first arises from its own project, but as a self, it is the being of its ground. The ground is always ground only for a being whose being has to take over being the ground. I think the key phrase there, if I can find it again. Probably in that fourth line from the end of that paragraph, or fifth line at the end, Dasein is not itself the ground of its being. And the reason for that, because the ground first arises from its own project. So the ground does not pre-exist Dasein's project, but Dasein in projecting, right? And projecting, as he says elsewhere, filling that in a little bit, projecting on its own most possibilities of being. Dasein in projecting, I want to say what gives rise to the ground that it is. Project, now this is relevant to what comes up later on in today's assignment. The project nature of Dasein is associated, in terms of the structure of temporality, the project nature is associated with the notion of the future. So Dasein as existence, as the being for whom, or for which, its being itself is a matter of concern, or its being itself is an issue, right? Right away there you see, if you meditate on that structure of existence as being the being for whom its being itself is an issue, is implicitly, if it isn't made explicit by Heidegger, which it is Dasein, Dasein's potentiality to be itself, right? In other words, if the being of the being that I am is an issue, you see, then my relationship to that being that I am, it can't be an issue if it's a simple actuality, right? So it's a matter, as it were, of potentiality, and if it's a matter of potentiality, then in terms of the structure of the temporality which Dasein is, and in terms of its and the terms that it in effect appropriates from the vulgar concept of time, then we're dealing with the future. So in other words, Dasein qua existence, in the Heideggerian sense of existence, is qua existence, it's a futural being, right? But the futural being, the being that has a future, that is constitutionally a potentiality to be itself, it has to realize itself in some sense, that potentiality is not something that exists apart from its being in the world ahead of itself, apart from its having, in the vulgar sense of the term, a past, do you see? Apart from its being conditioned, right? What is Sartre's appropriation of this idea? Being born. Sartre is kind of halfway between Augustine and Heidegger in this respect. Okay, in other words, Sartre's version of thrownness is being born. Right? You're born, and part of being born is, it's absurd. It's a dark. I mean, you got people that tell you, right? You got a birth certificate and so forth and so on, right? But imagine where would you be if you had no birth certificate? And no one was around to explain to you where you came from. You see, or that you right? And you just found and you think of Levinas here too. See, Levinas picks up on this idea, and he takes it back in that before to that less than nothing world. You say that that altogether pre-consciousness realm in which, in Levinas's metaphor, as I extracted from otherwise than being, the self is related to the other as stuffed with the other, and the analogy is the maternal relationship between the mother and the child before birth and after conception. Except that in Levinas, there's no moment of conception. There's no beginning of this, right? The indebtedness is there before any initiative is taken. You see, I'm not having made a mistake, not having failed to do something, or not having done something that I shouldn't have done. No. But in Heideggerian terms, in Levinas, I am guilty, as it were. You see, from time immemorial. All right. There's no beginning to this. Well, that's Levinas's version of Heidegger's thrownness, and Sartre's a little more accessible version of thrownness is just the fact that I'm born. I'm in the world, having been born into the world, and that is that's kind of the limit of my comprehension of my being here, right? All right. So the throne. All right. So if the ground preceded Dasein. If there was a ground for, which he's just finished denying, right? Or if Dasein were the ground of its being, then Dasein could pre-exist itself. Or another way of putting it, if Dasein were the ground of its being, it could account for itself. It could explain to itself why it is, right? It could. I think another way of putting it is it could be the cause of its own being. It could be in who is it? Not Leibniz, his counterpart there, Spinoza. Causa sui, right? It could be God. You see, so he wants, but God. Now, this is not the God of Thomas Aquinas, you understand, who is not a causa sui, right? But God of Spinoza is a causa sui, a cause of itself. And so one way of positioning Heidegger in the history of thought, not only vis-a-vis Hegel, who takes the causa sui of Spinoza and Leibnizes it, he radically subjectivizes it, right? So he marries, Hegel does, he takes the cause of itself of Spinoza, the materialism of Spinoza, and the idealism of Leibniz, the pure subjectivity of the sufficient reason of all things, you see. And Hegel synthesizes those two and produces the ultimate absolute idea, the ultimate version of the modern God, the modern absolute self-consciousness. But what I'm trying to say is that what we have in Heidegger is, again, an undermining of that absolute self-consciousness, an undermining of what otherwise in Spinoza's terms would be a causa sui, or another, where I'm going is I want to say what we get in Heidegger, in effect, is the finite version of a cause of itself. Now, the finite version of a cause of itself, right, is not a cause of itself in the sense that it is the ground of its own being, right, but in the sense that it is, I have to be careful here with the language, it is, I was going to say responsible, but better Heideggerian way. It calls itself, you say, from its lostness. It calls itself to a resolute grasp of its own, resolute grasp of its own being in the world. I want to say almost a resolute grasp of its own freedom, but again, I have to emphasize here, this freedom is very, very much a finite or conditioned freedom, or a freedom which is inseparable from the notion of thrownness. So thrownness is another form, concrete form in Heidegger of the finitude of human freedom, right? Without denying the reality of it. Now, I don't know if this sheds any light on your question or not.
No, it's very helpful. I mean, it's in some ways it's just another more subtle explanation of the existential quality of Dasein.
Right. And so the closest he comes to using the word imperative, which I happen to like, is in that last sentence of that paragraph. The ground is always ground only for a being whose being has to take over being the ground. You see? So he might have said, for whom the imperative, right, has to, right? For whom the imperative is to take over being the ground. All right. So on the next page, on 263 in the second paragraph, in the structure of thrownness, as well as in that of the project, essentially lies a nullity. And it is the ground for the possibility of the nullity of inauthentic Dasein in its falling prey, which it always already actually is factically. Care itself is in its essence thoroughly permeated with nullity. Care, the being of Dasein, thus means, as thrown project, being the null ground of a nullity. And that means that Dasein as such is guilty, if our formal existential definition of guilt as being the ground of nullity is valid. Existential nullity by no means has the character of a privation, which he's already said, of a lack as compared with an idea which is set up but is not attained in Dasein. Rather, the being of this being is already null as project before everything that it can project and usually attains. Right? Again, project implies the future. Well, involves the futorial nature of Dasein, or the potentiality that Dasein is irreducibly, potentiality to be itself. Still, in the next paragraph, still the ontological meaning of the notness of this existential nullity remains obscure, but that is true also of the ontological essence of the not in general. Of course, ontology and logic have expected much of the not, and thus at times made its possibilities visible without revealing it itself ontologically. Ontology found the not and used it, but is it then so self-evident that every not means a negativum in the sense of a lack? Does its positivity get exhausted by its constituting the transition? Why does every dialectic take refuge in negation without grounding it itself dialectically? Without even being able to locate it as a problem? Has anyone ever made the ontological origin of notness a problem at all, or before that even looked for the conditions on the basis of which the problem of the not and its notness and the possibility of this notness could be raised? And where else should they be found than in a thematic clarification of the meaning of being in general? Right, so there is an implicit critique of Hegel, but of all of the philosophical tradition, which, as it were, appropriated the not thoughtlessly or uncritically, that is not making a problem of it. All right. I think we should then move into, and in fact, we're about to move into today's assignment anyway, so let's move through that a little bit to
He doesn't
Yeah.
really finish that thought, right? He
Which
kind
one?
of-
Yeah, right,
He just kind of raises it like nobody's really questioned this notness, but he doesn't go on to thoroughly
Right.
do that himself. Am I right? It felt
right.
like-
I think
felt
that's
like
true.
kind
I think that's true.
Okay.
Thinking now occurring deals with the not as a purely as a differentiating. So, in other words, I think the thinking now occurring, the not in the not nothing, and the not nothing, and the not nothing, the zero unum one, that verbalization of that logic, where not nothing and not nothing is not. It becomes clear when you get to the not nothing. We get to the unum. You're not nothing, where in the negativity of the dialectical use of not, you would return to nothing, right? But you can't be returned to nothing because the first not nothing in the logic of the thinking now occurring does not assume as it were now, a pre-existent nothing, right? This is an issue that comes up. Maybe I should say, where is this? Let's go back just. I don't know whether let me just take a look at 261. I don't know whether he says it there, but I made a note to myself. He may or may not actually use that expression, out of nothing. Out of nothing. I don't know whether he uses the expression. However, in Novitas Mundi, when I'm dealing with Heidegger, I call him on this question of the nothing. And I use Aquinas' distinction of the Latin meaning of ex nihilo. And in Latin, there's an ambiguity in the ex. It can mean, as it's normally simply translated, ex, out of nothing. And Aquinas, therefore, because of that meaning in Latin, has to make explicit that that is not the meaning of ex nihilo. The world's being created out of nothing. Ex nihilo does not mean out of nothing in the sense, speaking logically, of Aristotelian-wise, as a material cause. Okay, so Thomas says ex means after nothing in the sense of the Latin expression ex dei, from this day forward, right? From this day, from here to there. So you could say that creation ex nihilo to Aquinas means that there is a first now is a matter of faith. It's not demonstrable. It is not a matter for Aquinas of reason in the sense of some reasoning. It's not something that can be arrived at by reasoning. It can't be arrived at it by reasoning because ex nihilo means after nothing. In other words, I want to say he doesn't speak this way, but it's the sense of the kind of perfect, if you can imagine, a perfect spontaneity of the being of the world, right? And in that sense, preceded by nothing, right? But not preceded by nothing as if nothing were something preceding it out of which it was made, you see, that accounts for it. Unlike, for example, the quantum vacuum of contemporary physics, quantum mechanics, the quantum vacuum, first of all, is not a vacuum. I mean, it's a vacuum, so-called vacuum, but it's not empty. All right, there's stuff in it. And since the singularity of the Big Bang would be understood somehow or other to have come, you could use the same phrase, ex nihilo, but right from nothing, but somehow or other it would have to be understood to have emerged from, so, as it were, spontaneously occurred out of a pre-existing vacuum, out of a nothingness, right? Which nevertheless, in contemporary physics, in keeping with modern thought, generally speaking, that vacuum, that nothing, is a kind of potentiality, all right? But elsewhere in Thomas, it's very clear that the creation ex nihilo is not, that nihilo is not a matter of potentiality. That's why X is not out of, right? Because whatever potentiality there is to the world is simultaneously created along with the actuality of the world at that first now, which is otherwise for Thomas I can't get my head around. I can't get my mind around it. Now the reason I'm rehearsing this is that I was saying the thinking now occurring, we have analogous to Thomas, we have the notion that so that even not nothing, since the not in the thinking now occurring is altogether free from the notion, to use Heideggerian language, the notion of lack or the notion of deficiency, altogether so. And I guess what I want to get to is that in Heidegger, even though he goes back from deficiency and lack to a nullity, which I've defined as an emptiness, an openness, something positive in terms of which Dasein has the potentiality to be itself, right? But it's a positive. But that nullity is a potentiality. That's what I'm getting at. So he has incorporated the kind of pure potentiality of modernity, which I also identify or call attention to in somewhere there in in the middle chapters of Novitas Mundi, he has undermined that pure potentiality in the sense that he has finitized it, if I can use that word. He has finitized it in making it the very structure of Dasein, of that being which is in the world ahead of itself. All right? And so in that sense, he has, okay. And therefore, going back to taking Kierkegaardian singularity, ontological Kierkegaardian singularity down to the level of primordial singleness in terms of authentic being toward death of Dasein, just as take the ontic mathematical objective presence notion of belonging, undermining it in terms of the fundamental belonging of Dasein to being, and so forth and so on, the belonging of Dasein to the world and the world to Dasein. So, analogously, he has taken the notion, and guilt, down to the primordial, the ontic guilt down to primordial guilt. So here what's going on is we're taking the ontic experience of the not, or as lack and deficiency, you say? Are we denying in Heidegger that there is lack and deficiency? No. Are we denying that there is ontic guilt? No. Are we denying that there is an existential solitude as experienced by Kierkegaard? No. But we're undermining all of those things, and Leahy's use of the word undermining here, right? And here we're undermining lack and deficiency by taking it down, as it were, to the primordial level of this potentiality of Dasein, which is constitutive of its very being, the potentiality to be itself. Okay? But, as contrasted with the thinking now occurring, we're leaving all those other things standing, existentially, ontically. We're leaving lack and deficiency. In the thinking now occurring, there's no lack. There is no deficiency. I hate to say it. My friend all times will be all over me. There is no guilt. Okay. And what else, right? There is no belonging. Okay? So the relationship of absolute particularity in the thinking now occurring, right? The relationship that exists among persons are not able to be understood in terms of belonging. They're able to be understood in terms of a perfect freedom of relationship, right? But not in the sense of connection. Right? All right. It's interesting. The other side of that distinction that Badiou makes that I called attention to earlier, that belonging is properly the mathematical relationship, and he says, it's very interesting. He says in the same paragraph, he compares the relationship epsilon to, although he doesn't have a symbol for it because it doesn't apply in set theory, he compares it to equality. And he says that belonging is the truly mathematical relationship, but equality, says Badiou, is really a logical concept as distinguished from a mathematical concept, which I found very interesting because in the thinking now occurring and in Foundation, especially in the logical middle of that book, I make the point that what I call real trinary logic, I don't know whether I put it exactly this way, but in effect I'm saying it's the first essentially logical logic, right? This question of the perfect equality, the perfect lack of belongingness, right? The perfect freedom of the relationship among persons in an absolute particularity is, in a certain sense, a kind of perfect equality. So that in that sense, so it really gets beyond guilt because it gets beyond the whole notion, which Levinas cannot get beyond, is deeply embedded in, the whole notion of claim, of one person having a claim upon another, right? If I'm related to you in perfect freedom, then I'm not related to you as a consequence of a claim you have upon me, or vice versa, right? That our relationship is not a matter of making claims upon one another implicitly or explicitly. Right? So if Badiou tells me that notion of equality is a logical notion, I'll run with that. Okay, in other words, that fits. So the thinking now occurring has an abhorrence of the notion of belonging and a great affection for the notion of equality, right? And therefore, now, however, the thinking now occurring wants to say that the mathematical realm is an this will be interesting. The mathematical realm as we ordinarily understand it, and therefore this would apply to Badiou too, although when I wrote this in Foundation I wasn't thinking about Badiou. But generally speaking, you could say that the thinking now occurring, ordinary mathematical understanding, which would include, I think, in the sense which I mean ordinary, Badiou's understanding of the foundational role of set theory in all mathematics, is a deficient mode of the of what I think I elsewhere call absolute ontology, of an absolute ontology, which is intelligible in terms of the thinking now occurring. So absolute ontology could translate into absolutely logical being. So absolutely logical being would have to be a being that was permeated through and through with a quality, you see? And to the extent to which ordinary mathematics, to the extent to which Badiou is correct about set theory and the mathematics which is founded upon it, that it is reducible, so to speak, to the relationship of belonging, to the extent to which that is true, then that ordinary mathematics is a deficient or inadequate understanding of the essential quality of all being, something like that. All right, that's a little bit of an aside, but it's implicitly relevant to what's going on here. Now let's see, what are we were about to move into.
63.
Oh, I had backed up looking for that phrase, but I'm not sure it's there, so I'm not going to worry about it. Moving into today's assignment, there's a reference on page 272 to a notion I think we've explored last time already, the uncanniness of the individuation that, well, we can read the paragraph on page 272, the second paragraph from the bottom of the page. What mood corresponds to such understanding? Understanding the call discloses one's own Dasein in the uncanniness of its individuation. The uncanniness revealed in understanding is genuinely disclosed by the attunement of angst belonging to it. The fact of the angst of conscience is a phenomenal confirmation of the fact that in understanding the call, Dasein is brought face to face with its own uncanniness. Wanting to have a conscience becomes a readiness for angst. The third essential element of disclosedness is discourse. The first two, by the way, I think we understand, right, are understanding and attunement. Right? So the third essential element of disclosedness is discourse. The call itself is a primordial discourse of Dasein. On page 273, in the fifth line, the call introduces the fact of constantly being guilty and thus brings the self back from the loud idle chatter of the day's common sense. Thus the mode of articulative discourse belonging to wanting to have a conscience is reticence. We characterize silence as an essential possibility of discourse. Skipping the next sentence, in the summons, Dasein gives itself to understand its own most potentiality of being. Thus this calling is keeping silent. And the silence, of course, corresponds to the notion of emptiness, not speaking, there being nothing there to begin with, so to speak, the potentiality idea. So silence is, you might say, the appropriate form of discourse in the response to the call of consciousness, which he said elsewhere earlier on in previous assignments. The call of discourse, the call of conscience has nothing to say. Right? The discourse of conscience never comes to utterance. Conscience only calls silently, that is, the call comes from the soundlessness of uncanniness and calls Dasein thus summoned back to the stillness of itself. Dropping down a couple of paragraphs, again on the same page 273, the second paragraph beginning on that page from the bottom. The disclosedness of Dasein in wanting to have a conscience is thus constituted by the attunement of angst, by understanding is projecting oneself upon one's own most being guilty, and by discourse as reticence. All right, so if you just parse that sentence, he's included these three fundamental elements of disclosedness, of Dasein, that is vis-a-vis attunement, angst, vis-a-vis understanding, projecting oneself upon one's own most being guilty. And we're going to see in a moment, there's a kind of fundamental repetitive structure that he uses here, and it bears on this question of the temporality of Dasein. And discourse, vis-a-vis discourse, is reticence. We shall call the eminent, authentic disclosedness attested in Dasein itself by its conscience, the reticent projecting oneself upon one's own most being guilty, which is ready for angst, resoluteness. All right, so there we get, in effect, a definition of what he means by resoluteness. It's the reticent projecting oneself upon one's own most being guilty, which is ready for angst. Resoluteness is an eminent mode of the disclosedness of Dasein, but in an earlier passage, disclosedness was interpreted existentially as primordial truth. Dropping down a couple of lines, truth must be understood as a fundamental existential. Our ontological clarification of the statement that Dasein is in the truth has pointed to the primordial disclosedness of this being as the truth of existence. And for its delineation, we have referred to the analysis of the authenticity of Dasein. Now, in resoluteness, the most primordial truth of Dasein has been reached because it is authentic. The disclosedness of the there discloses equi primordially the whole being in the world being in, and the self that is this being as I am. With the disclosedness of world, inner worldly beings have always already been discovered. The discoveredness of things at hand and objectively present is grounded in the discoveredness of the world. For if the actual totality of relevance of things at hand is to be freed, this requires a pre-understanding of significance. In understanding significance, Dasein, taking care of things, is circumspectly referred to the things at hand and counted. The understanding of significance as the disclosedness of the actual world is again grounded in the understanding of for the sake of which, to which discovering of the totality of relevance goes back. This is a kind of summary here, begins here, and for several pages now is a kind of recapitulation of things that he said earlier. Okay, so skipping a few lines. Thrown into its there, Dasein is always factically dependent on a definite world, its world. All right, so again, this definite world here is distinguishes Heidegger's analysis from the Husserlian type of relationship of the transcendental subjectivity and the ego thereof to a world in general, right? To a world whose existence and whose substantiality is in question. Primordially, Dasein is always factually dependent upon a definite world, and that definite world is its world, not a world, not any world in general, in that sense. At the same time, those nearest factical projects are guided by the lostness in the they taking care of things. This lostness can be summoned by one's own Dasein. The summons can be understood in the mode of resoluteness. But authentic disclosedness then modifies equi-primordially the discoveredness of world grounded in it and the disclosedness of being with the others. The world at hand does not become different as far as content. The circle of the others is not exchanged for a new one. And yet the being toward things, of taking care of things, it's a modification of taking care of things, and it's a modification of being with others. And that the form of that modification is authentic resoluteness, so that now one is taking care of things and one is with others in terms of one's own most potentiality of being a self. As authentic being a self, resoluteness does not detach Dasein from its world, nor does it isolate it as free-floating ego. How could it, if resoluteness as authentic disclosedness is, after all, nothing other than authentically being in the world? And again, I want to make a little commentary here vis-a-vis the thinking now occurring. In the morality seminar, responding to Agamben's referencing the notion of the I, terms like I and now are sometimes referred to as shifters. There's another expression which Agamben used, I can't remember what it was, in the sense that a shifter in linguistics is understood to be a word, the concrete significance of which you don't know apart from the context, right? So if someone says, if you hear the word I, and you don't see and don't recognize the voice, if you have no context for the I, you don't know who's talking. If I say I, we know in the context that this I is Leahy, right? If you say I, we know in the context this I is Lobel, right? But I, we all can say I, you see, and everything depends upon its being related to a particular context, right? Well, the thinking now occurring was long ago defined somewhere in Foundation as absolutely contextual, okay? So I'm reminded of that here because what we got here is that Heidegger wants to associate Dasein with its world, right? Its definite world. In the thinking now occurring, the identity of the world and the I is, how shall I put it?
Alex,
put it another way. That in the thinking now occurring, the I is identically is identified with the world. The I is identified with the world. And it goes back to my discussion, taking advantage of Badiou's distinction between belonging and identity. The I, or the true self of Dasein, might be a better way of putting it, in Heidegger is not, as it is in the thinking now occurring, identified with, parenthesis, its world, identified with the world, right? With the world and is otherwise definite, but rather the world belongs to Dasein and Dasein belongs together with this world, you see? But the notion of identity as this relationship is not there. In effect, what is substituted for it is the notion of belonging in Heidegger. All right, so resoluteness brings the self right into its being together with things at hand, actually taking care of them, and pushes it toward concerned being with the others. In the light of the for the sake of which of the potentiality of being which it has chosen, resolute Dasein frees itself for its world. The resoluteness toward itself first brings Dasein to the possibility of letting the others who are with it be in their own most potentiality of being, and also discloses that potentiality and concern which leaps ahead and frees. Resolute Dasein can become the conscience of others. It is from the authentic being a self of resoluteness that authentic being with one another first arises. Not from ambiguous and jealous stipulations and talkative fraternizing in the they and in what they wants to undertake. In accordance with its ontological essence, resoluteness always belongs to a factical Dasein. The essence of this being is its existence. Resoluteness exists only as a resolution that projects itself understandingly. But to what does Dasein resolve itself in resoluteness? On what is it to resolve? Only the resolution itself can answer this, right? And again, because of the, how can I put it? The fundamentally deep, the fundamentally inexhaustible potentiality. I don't mean infinite potentiality in the extensive sense, right? But the irreducible potentiality of the structure of Dasein is such, right, that it can realize its own potentiality only in the resolution itself. It would be a complete misunderstanding of the phenomenon of resoluteness if one were to believe that it is simply a matter of receptively taking up possibilities presented and suggested. resolution is precisely the disclosive projection and determination of the actual factical possibility. Right? Because, well, to the extent to which it is the projection and determination of the actual factical possibility, resolution is that, and resolution is Dasein's projecting itself understandingly upon its possibilities. Right? It resolves upon an actual factical possibility as it were, I was going to say the embodiment of, or maybe we can just leave that out or bracket it, as the embodiment of, it resolves upon the actual factical possibility as the embodiment of its own most potentiality to be. It can only do that because of the belonging together, the inseparability of the ontic and the ontological. It can only do that. The key word here, I would say, is factical. It can only realize its authentic potentiality to be. It can only do so by projecting itself upon an actual factical possibility. And it does that, it projects it upon itself in such a way that that projection is a determination of that as its possibility, as its actual factical possibility. Factical here being, in effect, the equivalent of the notion of the ontical, of the finding itself in the everyday, in the everyday world ahead of itself, or finding itself in the everyday world in the state of thrownness. Right? So, in other words, this resoluteness has for its object, as it were, I want to say, a real factical possibility, not an abstract ontological possibility. Question?
I'm I think stuck on how important in the argument thus far. In order to get to resoluteness, we have to go through or experience, or there has to be the non-relatedness of Dasein,
Right.
and
The uncanniness. Right.
of basically
being
death.
toward death, right?
And so that non-relatedness, how does that become this possibility of freeing Dasein to actually take care of and be with others? Do you see the question? So we start with being in the world,
Mm-hmm.
but then the more we, I don't know if this is proper, but the more we understand or the deeper we go into the structure of Dasein, that being in the world shows itself to be non-relatedness in being towards death. Or the being towards
Right.
death.
Well,
shows itself to
death
be
as
non-
the possibility of its impossibility, and this is a non-relational possibility of its own possibility. It's an individuating or isolating or singularizing
Right.
of Dasein in its authentic
Right.
being toward death.
And so, in this authentic, non-relational possibility,
Right.
we now are understanding. It seems like the resoluteness brings the self right into its being together with things at hand, actually
Right.
taking care of
Okay.
them. So, couldn't you just
So
speak through the movement into the world
Well,
again?
Well, I think you're asking, I don't know how to phrase it adequately, but you're asking something like, well, I think what I'm hearing is, what's the point? If we're talking about this isolation of the self in this being toward death, and then all of this is to somehow to bring us right back into the world, in taking care of things and being related to others, right? Something like that.
No, I mean, I definitely
I think
see
the
the point. It's just how does that
the
work?
point, well, when you say how does it work, I'm not sure what you mean, but what I was first going to say, and that this is that the issue is whether or not one is taking care of things and is related to others authentically. That's the issue. Or is one forgetful, you see, of the of the
call
one.
of Dasein.
Huh?
Of the call of Dasein.
Well, yeah, forgetful of the call or unheedful of the call, forgetful of, I want to say, of what it means to be in the world. Right? So we are initially, and for the most part, forgetful. And we're then the call of angst, or the angst as the possibility of being recalled from this lostness, is a state of remembering. It's a state of so I think when you say, I'm not sure what you mean by how does one do it, but I'm tempted to say the trick is to be taking care of things and being with and being concerned for others. Authentically, that is, the trick is to do so without forgetting one. I won't want to say that one is dying, one's own death, right? So now I'm not sure what how would mean. I mean, how does one do that?
Maybe another way to phrase it is,
Yeah.
we didn't start this book with a suggestion that we choose to be in the world and care for others. That's a description of Dasein, right? We are related. It's a
We are.
description of-
We
being
didn't
in the
choose
world.
it.
Exactly.
We're thrown.
Exactly.
Okay.
We're thrown.
Okay.
It's not like we decide to do that. We are
Right.
being in the world. So, but then we understand this non-relational possibility of Dasein.
Right.
And it would seem at that point that the being in the world of that relation and care for others has profoundly changed, if not disappeared altogether, in the non-relation. So what it sounds like at this point is that now we're somehow choosing, or there's a way of being that now can authentically be with others. But that's not what being in the world was to start with. It's not like somehow we achieve resoluteness and then we decide to
No.
be in the world again. We've always been in the world.
That's right.
So
well, I think what I heard, maybe I misheard. In other words, it's not, there is no either or here.
Right.
Okay. So in that sense, it's the equivalent on the primordial level of a synthesis, right? Okay. It's not quite synthesis, but it's, the way he uses it, expresses it often here is a modification.
Yes.
It's a modification of the way, if you want to put it that way, of the way we take care of things or the way we are with others. It's a modification, but it doesn't require. It's not. There's not a completely new being by any means. It doesn't even occur as a real possibility here, right? So it's just a question of. I want to say this gets a little more technical as we get further on in today's assignment, but later on let's see if I can find where this is. On page 307 and following, he adds, let's see, I don't know whether we can, let me see if we can jump there.
No, we would skip ecstasy and
Yeah, we're going to do a little ecstasy.
temporality.
Yeah, all right. Well, hold your finger where we are. Just we won't jump exactly, but we'll just take note of it. On 307 and elsewhere, by the way, in this section on temporality and everydayness, actually on page 308 and 309, and in particular at the bottom of the paragraph on page 309. Now, he does this several places. In fact, the whole following section is going to be a working through of what he delineates there in the very last line of the top paragraph on page 309, that the possible structural unity of, right, so he's talking about the one temporality that holds within itself the possible structural unity of understanding, attunement, entanglement, and discourse. Now, if you're paying attention as we've been reading through this, I believe that this is the first time. Certainly, if he has done anything close to this before, this is the first time that I've caught it explicitly doing it, and here he really runs with it. He's mentioned all of these things before, but as we just said a little earlier in the commentary on the text, the normal lineup is understanding, attunement, and Discourse. And of course he's spoken of entanglement, which before and early and so forth. But here he lines them. He makes a quartet out of these four things. Okay, and he will say. He will call attention. And if I were to take out understanding, so what I want to do is what I'm noticing here. What I'm noticing right away when I get to this page, is that he's put entanglement. It's not a new idea, but he's incorporated it now in this list. Okay, and when he does that in the context of temporality, then he does, and we need to understand that understanding, right, relates to the futural dimension, for want of a better term, the futural element of the temporal structure of Dasein. Right? Understanding has to do with potentiality and the future. Remember, he said very early on, or I think he said it, and then we checked it out in the German, that to understand in German can mean to be able to do something. Right? So ability, the capacity, the potentiality. Right? So understanding has to be not an abstract understanding now, but this existential Heideggerian understanding of Dasein is being able to deal with the world, right? Okay. The second attunement is the notion of which angst is the preeminent form of attunement. Nevertheless, attunement, generally speaking, angst also is the notion of having been. All right, it's the notion of thrownness, right? So when I'm anxious, right, what I'm really experiencing, what's being called to my attention first and foremost, at least, is my lack of control, my being thrown, my being in the middle of nowhere, so to speak, right, in some sense. And then the third, now here's the thing, the third, in the context of this latter part of the book, entanglement, is to be related to the, all right, so in vulgar temporal terms, understanding is the future. Vulgar future, but futural element of temporality in a non-vulgar sense. Attunement is the having been, or the vulgar past. You see? And then entanglement, this is what's interesting to me. Entanglement corresponds to the vulgar present. You see? Okay, well that should do it, but and if he hadn't done that, I would have said understanding is the future. I'm speaking loosely now. I'm speaking just, all in quotes. Understanding is the future, attunement is the past, and discourse is the present. I would have said that. But I can't say that because he put entanglement in there in the third place. Right, you see? Now we only have a past, present, and future. See, it really interests me. We only have a past, present, and future. But now we got four things to fit into this threesome. And then I start thinking about the thinking now occurring and the real trying to be logic. And fourthness. I start thinking about fourthness. Right? And I'm saying, well, there's a certain point of contact, a certain empathy here of the thinking now occurring to what Heidegger is doing here. And I wonder how far it goes, right? And we'll see if we ever get there, which I think we will. That he, in his own way, acknowledges a certain role for discourse in the present. This is what made me think of this, to jump ahead without jumping ahead. And that the way in which the modification takes place, the way in which the modification takes place from the original entanglement, in that negative sense, that present, that being present in a forgetful mode, right? The being lost in the immediacy of what is at hand, or in the dealings with others. You see that present in the negative sense, that present as lostness. Okay, the way in which that is modified is in discourse. In other words, the discourse is related to the present as entanglement is related to the present because discourse is the mode of the modification of what otherwise would be simply the present as entanglement. Right? So discourse takes us right back to the beginning of the book, the notion of logos, the notion of a disclosedness. Right? So the disclosedness, the discourse is the and discourse operates in the very nature of angst and in the very nature of the call of consciousness and conscience and so forth in the mode of silence, right? So for him, silence is not an alternative to discourse, right? So the nullity, the potentiality of Dasein, insofar as it is called attention to by the call of conscience. That call of conscience has nothing to say, which corresponds to the openness, that finite freedom, for want of a better term, that Dasein is in its belonging together with the world. Right? I want to say that the change, if change is the right word here, right? The modification takes place in the way one articulates one's being in the world, the way in which Dasein articulates its being in the world to itself. So I think this might go to your how question. In other words, how do you do that? And that's going to pedestrianize it, but I think it's not too far off. Dasein is able to resolutely take care of things and resolutely be related to others with whom other being withs, that is with Dasein. All right? It's able to do that resolutely, I want to say not so much by thinking differently in an abstract conceptual sense, right? But by talking to itself differently. I want to say something like that, by discoursing to itself differently. Now, it may be that the way in which it talks to itself differently is silence, is reticence. Reticence, yeah. But it is that so discourse is the something like that which, right? So I'm thinking now in terms of the real trying to be logic, especially as applied in the ethics and morality seminars, and in the ethics seminar where I have the 4 dimensions of the ethic of simplicity. The 4th dimension in thinking now occurring is creation. It's gratitude ethically, right? But logically, and this is the real interesting thing that I was thinking when I was reading this section for tonight, in the thinking now occurring, you have 0, unum, 1, and that wouldn't do it either. You need another 1. And we had this discussion in here with Jim one day when he said, well, that's another number. No. First of all, they're not numbers. And secondly, even if they were numbers, the second 1 in the 0, unum, 1, 1 is not enough. It's not of the same character of the first, of the right. But on the other hand, you see, it's not totally different, because the third, which is 1, which would correspond here and just abstractly, right? 0, unum, 1 would be understanding, attunement, and entanglement. You see? Well, for Heidegger, if I say, I have the effrontery, the uncritical effrontery in the thinking now occurring to say, well, when you get to the 3rd dimension, what we're really talking about is doing the right thing. At which point, by the way, we're not talking about thinking about it, being ready, discerning. We're talking about action, do it. Okay? Well, you could see how a Heideggerian could jump in and say, well, that's very, very ontic of you, right? You see what I'm saying? Okay. The answer to that, by the way, is in the thinking now occurring, the ontic is identical with the ontological. Right? There's another way of parsing absolute ontology. Right? And so you could say, retrospectively, looking at Heidegger, the problem in Heidegger, in the context of thinking now occurring, is that while there is this kind of belonging together of the ontic and the ontological in the primordial dimension that he's dealing with, you see, they belong together, but they're not identical. Okay, because of the constant intrusion, constitutional. I don't mean, yeah, it is a constant intrusion, as we see in the latter part of today's assignment. The constancy, self-constancy, is an issue here, and that issue we discussed some time back there about identity. What does identity mean? Doesn't it mean sameness? Doesn't it mean right? And I'm saying identity doesn't mean that, although it has come to mean that in the world of self-consciousness, you see. And so we've gotten beyond the ego here. We've gotten beyond the ego abstracted from the world, but we haven't gotten beyond a selfhood to which world belongs and which belongs to world, you see. One of the things that Badiou makes a point of in his pure abstraction of set theory is that if you say alpha belongs to alpha epsilon beta, alpha belongs to beta, Badiou makes the point that there's no hierarchy there. In other words, in set theory, A belongs to B, but A and B are on the same list. Right? In effect, they're kind of interchangeable. Right? They're kind of interchangeable, and so the only way you discriminate in set theory between one thing and another, difference in set theory between two, how can I put it, identity. The identity of two sets is that all the members of this set are the members of this set. Then the two sets are identical. If one of the members of this set is not in this set, all the other members are, but one is missing, then they're different. And that's the only way you can establish different. Well, that is, even in set theory, just as a simple arithmetic, that's defining difference in terms of addition and subtraction. You see? So, in the thinking now occurring, difference is not a matter of more or less. It's not a matter of addition or subtraction, you see? And difference is identity, or identity is difference, totally apart from the notion of any kind of constancy. That's what I don't want to get off the track, but that came into my mind. So, and we'll come back to hopefully we'll get back to the self-constancy later on. Now, what got me up there? So that was my part of my answer to the how is by Dasein speaking to itself, articulating to itself its being in the world differently, in a different mode. I mean, the articulation being in a different mode. But that's the kind of the change that goes on, and that modifies what otherwise would be a simply unqualified entanglement. But by the way, it doesn't simply erase entanglement, right? In other words, it's never as if we are always resolute. You see, we are initially and for the most part, we're entangled, and we are called, I would say, unpredictably to resoluteness, and to the extent to which we are resolute, then we have modified that entanglement. But that's it. It's a modification of the way in which we find ourselves in relation. I think that's.
Could we say there are moments of resoluteness?
Oh well, the moment, yeah.
It's coming up.
There is, right. Okay.
Capital M.
I have a question
Yeah.
related to this, which is in the mode of authentic Dasein,
Right.
does thrownness continue? Is thrownness a primordial?
Oh yes. Oh, absolutely.
It never disappears. Whatever your state of
Right.
Dasein, inauthentic or authentic.
Right. It
And
never
so-
disappears because it's a particular element or dimension of the temporality that is Dasein in the primordial sense of temporality, not in the vulgar sense, right? So this being in the world ahead of oneself is the fundamental struggle, right? Being in the world ahead of yourself, that has to do with thrownness. And that, the whole idea of thrownness and the awareness of thrownness and the potentiality to be oneself and so forth, without being the ground of its own being, is irreducibly the structure.
So there's always backsliding. The possibility of backsliding is always there. Meaning,
Okay, yes.
Meaning, you may have achieved a degree of authenticity.
Right.
And yet,
You can't rest on your oars.
Exactly.
That's right. Yes, I think that's a fair statement. All right, let's move on a little bit here to Now what he does in the next section, section 3, 279 and following, he puts together, I think, again, for the first time in the text.
293?
I'm sorry, pardon me. Why did I say that? I mean 279. I don't know why I said that. That makes no sense at all. Yeah, section 3 I meant to say. Section 3, page 279 and following. He puts together on page 280 these two notions now of anticipation and resoluteness. Right?
That's what anticipation have to do with the being towards death.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. All right. So let's see what he says here. If we can do this on. Well, I guess we could begin at the very bottom of 279. Externally binding both phenomena together is intrinsically out of the question. That is key word. Externally binding resoluteness and anticipation being toward death. Externally binding them is out of the question. There is still one way out, and this is the only possible method to start from the phenomenon of resoluteness attested to in its existential possibility and to ask, does resoluteness in its own most existential tendency of being itself point ahead to anticipatory resoluteness as its own most authentic possibility? All right. So in other words, does resoluteness point ahead to its own most authentic possibility as anticipatory resoluteness? Okay. So existential resoluteness, and the answer, by the way, is yes. Okay. So stop answering the question. So existential resoluteness points ahead to, at least the possibility of its own most authentic possibility as being anticipatory resoluteness. A resoluteness points ahead to its being resoluteness as being toward death.
It seems like such a tautology. I mean, the resoluteness we've arrived at resoluteness through the anticipation of death. I mean, it seems like do you see what I'm saying? Why is that even a question? Resoluteness is precisely about anticipating death.
Well, it is. I mean, in a sense, it is. But if we go back to 273, where I think that's where he gave us his definition, he says there in the second paragraph from the bottom at the end, his definition of resoluteness is the reticent projecting oneself upon one's own most being guilty, which is ready for angst. So, I mean, ultimately, in fact, this is what he's doing here. He's tying it in with being toward death, and it is implicitly, right, but it's not explicitly. In other words, resoluteness explicitly is related to the notion of being guilty and being ready for angst, being ready for that which calls one to coming face to face with the possibility of one's for a non-relational possibility not to be. Right? Okay, so he makes some distinction here, right? But you're right in a general sense they are related, and of course if they weren't in general related, he couldn't. What he's doing now, he couldn't specifically bring them together as he wants to do here. All right, so he says in the let's see where what if resoluteness following its own meaning were brought into its authenticity only when it no longer projects itself upon arbitrary possibilities merely lying by, but rather upon the most extreme possibility that lies ahead of every factical potentiality of being of Dasein, and as such more or less enters without distortion every potentiality of being of Dasein factically seized upon? What if resoluteness as the authentic truth of Dasein reached the certainty authentically belonging to it only in the anticipation of death? All right. What if all the factical anticipatoriness of resolve were authentically understood, that is, existentially caught up with, only in the anticipation of death? Right. So the implication of that question is that an existential resoluteness, which has not, which is the projection of Dasein upon actual factical possibilities, if that is as far as it goes, that resoluteness is not the authentic resoluteness that it becomes, although it, how did he put it? It points ahead toward an anticipatory resoluteness. It's not, or it points ahead toward an authentic resoluteness. It's not that resoluteness that it will become when it's dealing not simply with actual factical possibilities, but when it's dealing with its ultimate constitutional possibility, I want to say, or ontological or existential possibility, which is
means by most extreme.
Yeah. It's
He uses that language, most extreme possibility of existence.
Okay. All right. Yes. All right. As long as our existential interpretation does not forget that the being given it as its theme has the kind of being of Dasein and cannot be joined together out of objectively present pieces into something objectively present, its steps must be guided by the idea of existence. And again, in that very specific sense of Heidegger, right? That existence, Dasein, its essence is existence. Its essence is to be that being for whom its being itself is an issue. For the question of the possible connection between anticipation and resoluteness, this means nothing less than the demand that we should project these existential phenomena upon the existential possibilities prefigured in them and think these possibilities through in an existential way. Now there you can see a concrete example of how the ontic and the ontological, or the existential and the existential, are related in the mode of belonging to one another. Okay, so projecting upon the existential phenomenon, projecting the existential upon the existential possibilities prefigured in them. But see, right away it's a twist, right? Projecting the existential phenomenon upon the existential possibilities prefigured in them, and think these possibilities through in an existential way. All right. All right. So then he says, if we cross over to the page next to it, page 281, the phenomenon of care, thus sufficiently clarified, can then be interrogated as to its ontological meaning. Defining this meaning will lead to the exposition of temporality. And care is somewhere defined in our reading today. I forget exactly where, but care is also defined as being toward death. All right. So these are overlapping care and anticipation are different terms for the same ultimate structure of Dasein, being toward death. And so dropping down a few lines in that paragraph on page 381, to the italics, temporality is experienced as a primordial phenomenon in the authentic being a whole of Dasein, in the phenomenon of anticipatory resoluteness. So the authentic being a whole of Dasein is, in effect, the phenomenon of anticipatory resoluteness. If temporality makes itself known primordially here, the temporality of anticipatory resoluteness is presumably a distinctive mode of that temporality. Temporality can temporalize itself in various possibilities and various ways. The fundamental possibilities of existence, the authenticity and inauthenticity of Dasein, are ontologically grounded in possible temporalizations of temporality. If the ontological character of its own being is remote from Dasein because of the dominance of its entangled understanding of being as objective presence, the primordial foundations of this being are still more remote. The primordial phenomenon of temporality in the bottom paragraph will be made secure by demonstrating that all the fundamental structures of Dasein exposed up to now are to be basically conceived temporally with regard to their possible totality, unity, and development, and as modes of the temporalizing of temporality. No, there's a...
I mean, as more authentic.
But it can be inauthentic and authentic, right? What page are you on?
Well, no, on 281, just same page.
Okay. Oh, I see it. I skipped that on. Yeah.
Yeah, the Sulzstein.
281, right. I thought it came up elsewhere too. Maybe
It
later
does
on.
a lot. No.
Later on, right?
Yeah. We could skip it now.
I think I want to skip that because I think it does come up again, and I want to make a little progress here textually. But while I'm moving forward, let me stop off on page 294 and 96, where he's been doing for a page or so a critique of Kant's notion of the I and the self and so forth. And on 294 and 96, actually probably on 295 in particular, in the bottom paragraph on 295, at the beginning of that paragraph, he says, for Kant, these representations are the empirical, which is accompanied by the I, the appearances to which the I is connected. But nowhere does Kant show the kind of being of this connection and accompanying. At bottom, however, their kind of being is understood as the constant objective presence of the I together with its representations. Kant did avoid cutting off the I from thinking, but without positing the I think itself in its full essential content as I think something, and above all, without seeing the ontological presupposition for the I think something as the fundamental determination of the self. All right? So Kant speaks of the I think. He speaks of the cogito in Cartesian language. And although he connects, as Heidegger puts it, the I think with what is intuited, right? With its empirical objects, he doesn't think more deeply that connection, you say? And so when I was saying that Heidegger is undermining, in this peculiar sense in which I'm using the term, undermining the mathematical notion of belonging, then he is likewise, maybe more than analogously, because mathematics is a fundamental paradigm for Kant's thinking about the relationship between the mind and reality. But he is likewise, Heidegger that is undermining the Kantian way of connecting the I think to what it thinks, you see? So it's not just a matter of connection or accompanying, or it's always there, you see? And he undermines it by reducing that being connected, that accompanying, by always finding it there, so to speak, by undermining it in the form of belonging. Again, you see? In other words, the I think something, primordially understood as it is in Heidegger, becomes I am in the world. I and the world belong together. Right?
I have a context.
Huh?
And I have a context for my thinking.
Okay, right, okay. All right, so the I think something is a fundamental determination of self. For even the point of departure of the I think something is not definite enough ontologically because the something remains indefinite. But if by this something we understand an inner worldly being, it tacitly implies that the world has been presupposed. Right? So if the Kantian I is connected with or accompanied by what in effect, from a Heideggerian understanding, are merely inner worldly beings, what has not been thought through here in Kant is the world itself in which these inner worldly beings are encountered. Right? This very phenomenon of the world also determines the constitution of being of the I, if indeed it is to be possible for the I to be something like an I think something. So the deeper, more primordial understanding of I think something, saying I means the being that I always am as I am in a world. Kant did not see the phenomenon of world and was consistent enough to keep the representations at a distance from the a priori content of the I think. All right, but thus the I again was forced back to an isolated subject that accompanies representations in a way that is ontologically quite indefinite. Speaking of so on 297, beginning at the very bottom of 296, the last sentence, the constancy of the self, this is where it comes up again, in the double sense of constancy and steadfastness, is the authentic counter possibility to the lack of constancy of irresolute falling prey. Existentially, the constancy of the self means nothing other than anticipatory resoluteness. Its ontological structure reveals the existentiality of the selfhood of the self. So it is the counter possibility of the lack of constancy, of irresolute falling prey. Right? So constancy of self is the, I want to say, keeping in mind, that is the remembering by Dasein of its almost potentiality to be itself. That's the constancy of self. When it is forgetful of that, right? When it is lost in everydayness, when it is fallen prey, right? It is irresolute and it is inconstant. You see, because and the form of the evidence, the ontic evidence of that inconstancy of the self, of that having forgotten itself, right, in falling prey, is what he spends a fair amount of time on. I don't know we will have spent that much time on it, but the whole notion of curiosity, right, of the going from one thing to another, right, is just kind of, you almost want to say it's the external, as it were, manifestation, you see, of the inconstancy, of the irresolute state of Dasein in its fallen, in its being fallen, or in its falling prey, for one. Okay. Okay. Now, let me get to that. Okay, so beginning around 300 and following, he distinguishes, he's trying to distinguish this primordial sense of temporality from any kind of vulgar sense of time. And he says on page 301, in the first paragraph beginning on 301, being ahead of itself, being ahead of oneself, is grounded in the future. Already being in makes known having been. So speaking of thrownness, right? Already being in makes known having been. Thrownness, in effect, being together with is made possible in making present. After what we have said, it is automatically ruled out to conceive the ahead in the ahead of itself and the already in terms of the vulgar understanding of time. The ahead does not mean the before in the sense of a not yet now, but later, nor does the already mean a no longer now, but earlier. If the expressions ahead of and already had this temporal meaning, they have a temporal meaning, right? But in the primordial sense, if they had this temporal meaning, which they can also have, then we would be anything. We would be saying anything. Then we would be saying about the temporality of care that it is something that is earlier and later, and not yet and no longer at the same time. Then care would be conceived as a being that occurs and elapses in time. The being of a being of the nature of Dasein would then turn into something objectively present. If this is impossible, the temporal significance of these expressions must be a different one. The before and the ahead of indicate the future that first makes possible in general the fact that Dasein can be in such a way that it is concerned about its potentiality of being. The self-project grounded in the for the sake of itself in the future is an essential quality of existentiality. Its primary meaning is the future. Similarly, the already means the existential, temporal meaning of the being that in that it is always already something thrown, that is always already, in effect, has a past. But only because care is grounded in having been can Dasein exist as the thrown being that it is. As long as Dasein factically exists, it is never past, but it is always already having been, in the sense that I am as having been. So Dasein is never past. To be something simply past, that is, right, is to be something objectively present, an objectively present thing. And by the way, an objectively present thing could never say, "I am past." So, I mean, you could even be a little more brutal with the language than Heidegger is here. You could say, "I am past," but if you say, "I am past," you ain't past. You ain't simply past as an objective thing, right? I am past. I am my past. I am my past. I am thrown. I am having been. I am. Right? Okay, so always having been in the sense that I am as having been, or I am as past. And only as long as Dasein is can it be as having been. All right, so that's what right. Only insofar as Dasein is, as being there is, can it be as having been. Right. So I can't separate the past from the present, and I think we already know.
Augustine again.
Huh?
It's Augustine in the Confessions again.
Why do you say?
He does this. He breaks down
Yeah.
the temporality, the experience of the past and present.
Yeah.
Past
Okay.
and the future are only through nowness.
Okay, all right. Yes, except that Heidegger would undermine the nounness aspect. He would turn the nounness into the present, and particularly at the present moment, right? Okay, but yes, fundamentally, that's the ontological analog of what's going on here. On the other hand, we call beings past that are no longer objectively present. Thus, existing Dasein can never ascertain itself as an objectively present fact that comes into being and passes away with time and is already partially past. Since it can't, by the way, objectively, it can't ascertain itself as that's another way of saying it's thrown. It can only experience itself as thrown. It can't be the ground. It cannot be its own ground. Okay. It always finds itself only as a thrown fact. There it goes. In Attunement, Dasein is invaded by itself as the being that it still is and already was. That is, that it constantly is as having been. The primary existential meaning of facticity lies in having been. Next paragraph. On the other hand, such an indication is lacking for the third constitutive factor of care, entangled being together with. That is not supposed to mean that falling prey is not also grounded in temporality. It should instead intimate that making present as the primary basis for falling prey to things at hand and objectively present that we take care of remains included in the future and in having been in the mode of primordial temporality. So the futural element, the falling prey element, the present, is included in the past and the future elements. It reminds me a little bit of the relativity, and that's why you say analogously. If there was any way of, which there is not, if there was any way of simply superimposing Heidegger on the thinking now occurring, then that present would have to be not simply included in the past and the future. You say it would not. Reminds me of what I'm getting at is Peirce's idea that the third, the now in which we always find ourselves, you see, is between the absolute first and the absolute last. The absolute past and the absolute future is that third, which is always, in Peirce's language, of its very nature, relative. All right. So the includedness of the present in the past and the future in Heidegger is analogous to Peirce in a way that neither of them are analogous to the absoluteness of the now in the thinking now occurring. All right. The last sentence. Resolute Dasein has brought itself back out of falling prey in order to be all the more authentically there for the disclosed situation in the moment. Temporality makes possible the unity of existence, facticity, and falling prey. So this is, I think, what I was referring to before when I was doing the foursome on page 3.7 and following. What we have here, the beginning here, is that the unity, temporality, it makes possible what he calls the unity of existence, which would correspond to the potentiality, the futural element of temporality, facticity, which would correspond to the already having been, the past quotes, element of temporality, and falling prey to the present element of temporality, and thus constitutes primordially the totality of the structure of care. The factors of care are not pieced together cumulative any more than temporality itself has first been put together out of the future, present, past, and present in the course of time. Temporality is not a being at all. It is not, but rather temporalizes itself, which I think was your initial question was what are we talking about here, right? It temporalizes itself. Temporality is not a being. Temporality, I want to say, it is, as it were, it is an activity. It is It is some sort of a ontological doing. It is a, right? So in other words, it's a active structure. Temporality is an active structure that makes itself. Huh?
It does things.
Well, it does things, but it does itself. I want to say it does itself. Or it's not a being in the sense that it is not something apart from its doing itself, from its being. It's not a being, but it is the being, the unity of the potentiality and the having been and the being present of Dasein. Right? And in that sense, it's not a being, but it is that structural working out, maybe. All right, so he says, the reason for this can be made intelligible only when we have clarified the area of being and the is as such. Temporality temporalizes, and it temporalizes possible ways of itself. All right, so in the next paragraph, future, having been, and present show the phenomenal character of toward itself back to letting something be encountered. See, that's interesting because that's going to anticipate on page 307 and following that foursome in which he has added, that he's put entanglement where the present is and he's added discourse to it. And then later on he's going to say the discourse modifies, in effect modifies the entanglement. I don't know that he fully says it, but the implication is that it really pertains to the whole of temporality. Right? That's the sense I have. But what interests me in this sentence on page 302 is that the future toward itself, the having been, the back to, and then notice the present, the letting something be encountered. Well, that takes us right back to the logos idea. That's the discourse idea, right? So even though he's going to put the falling prey and entanglement in the place of the present, that falling prey is the negative of the discourse, which is the logos in which something is allowed to be encountered. You follow what I'm saying? In other words, the falling prey is nothing. The reason the falling prey and the discourse are both of them in some sense related, even though there doesn't seem to be room for both of them, to the present. They're related properly to the present because both of them are, one is the negative form of, it's the negative, it's the fallen prey is the fallen form of the discourse. It's the lack of silence. It's the noise. It's the idle talk. What does he talk about? Idle chatter, idle talk. You see? So the world of the they, the world of in which we are fallen prey, which is the present world. Okay, always the present, in which the inauthentic realm is nevertheless a realm of discourse, but it's idle discourse. It's idle chatter. It's idle talk. Right? So is it encountering beings? Well, yeah, it is, but inauthentically. It's encountering beings in the sense of controlling them or mastering them, or you see, but not in terms of letting them present themselves. You see, it's imposing upon them a certain construct rather than being open to them or being the opening in which they present themselves. Right? Okay, and so you can see why the technology is least problematic. So the phenomenon toward to, together with, revealed temporality as the ecstaticon par excellence. Temporality is the primordial outside of itself, in and for itself. Thus we call the phenomenon of future, having been and present, the ecstasies of temporality. Temporality is not prior to this a being that first emerges from itself. Its essence is temporalizing in the unity of the ecstasies. What is characteristic of the time accessible to the vulgar understanding consists of, skip a few words, of a pure succession of nows, without beginning, without end, in which the ecstatic character of primordial temporality is leveled down. That's the inauthentic kind of kind of time.
Why is this outside? What is this doing? This static time. Why is temporality?
Well, I think
outside of itself.
It's outside of itself. Because it's another version. Remember when he was talking about temporality and being way back in the text, he said that being is temporal, and the only being and the being we're talking here is the being of Dasein, whose being itself is for itself an issue. Okay, so right there, if existence, he might just as well have said that existence is temporality. If existence is what Dasein does or is, you see, Dasein exists. Dasein exists means Dasein is concerned, is being in a way that is concerned for its own being, for whom its own being is an issue. Well, that means what? That Dasein must be somehow removed from itself. It must have a sufficient distance from itself. It's ecstatic in its nature. I'm saying, in other words, temporality is ecstatic because temporality is what the being of Dasein is, and being outside of itself is the prerequisite for being concerned with its own being, right? In the sense in which the doorknob is never ecstatic. The doorknob is never. As soon as the doorknob was ecstatic in this sense, it would be temporalizing, right? It would be concerned with its own being. It would be aware of its own potentiality to be, of its having to be. Okay. So the doorknob doesn't have to be, but somehow I have to be, not in the way in which a doorknob might have to be, you see, but in terms of the realization of my own potentiality to be, the realization of my own freedom, I want to say. Right? But it's a finite freedom. It's a thrown freedom. So the ecstatic is not. So Dasein and the temporality that is the structure of Dasein is ecstatic. It's outside of itself. But understand, it's outside of itself. In other words, it's not altogether outside. It's not absolute exteriority such as we find the thinking now occurring.
Is it also a play with the notion of static as still, ecstatic as it's also not? It's not. I mean, there's a movement to that.
Yeah, no, I understand. I think. Well, there's that Latin expression, by the way, in the bottom of that paragraph. Oh, fit. That was it. There's no noun, but you could put in a noun. Fit. It just means is. The term is derived from. That's just fit. It is. Yeah, possibly. I don't know that he plays with that though. I don't. It doesn't resonate with me in terms of his use of the term, but I can see that's a possibility. In enumerating the next paragraph, in enumerating the ecstasies, we have always mentioned the future first. That should indicate that the future has priority in the ecstatic unity of primordial and authentic temporality. And so that's another way of saying, in terms of existence, I don't know whether I said it this way. I said the future is ahead of itself, the past is having been, the present is here and now, or the future is existence, and the past is facticity. I don't know if he does, but I want to make that explicit. And the present is the falling prey. So he's saying that the future comes first, so to speak. It has priority, although temporality does not first originate through a cumulative sequence of the actions, but always temporalizes itself in their equi-primordiality. But within this equi-primordiality, the modes of temporalizing are different. And at the bottom of that paragraph on that page, primordial and authentic temporality temporalizes itself out of the authentic future, and indeed in such a way that futurally having been, it first arouses the present. Now he's done a simpler original version of this in the early part of the text, right, where he says that Dasein is its past, right, and is what it is and what it is comes out of the future, right? So this is just a reworking of that in this context. And notice, therefore, his main point is that these are equally primordial, even though we start with the present. We start with the future. Even when he speaks of the future, that the future is the authentic future is a futural having been, right? It's a having been that arrives from the future, and as such, it first arouses the present. The primary phenomenon of primordial and authentic temporality is the future. Oh, and there it is in the next paragraph. Care is being toward death. Care, therefore, is anticipation.